Merba l-ewwel episodju tal-proġett SIEGħA li qed jittellab kollaborazzjoni bejn The Critical Angle Project u NEWZ.mt. Lieku kelli nsaqsikom lil min iċċemplu f'sitwazzjoni fejn għandkom problema mas-sit tal-post fejn tgħixu. F'min taħsbu? Illum ser nitkellmu ma' Gabriel Apap li huwa s-Segretarju Teżorier tal-Għaqda Solidarjetà, union ġdida li ġiet iffurmata fi frar li għadda li timmielita ħafna speċifikament fuq id-drittijiet tan-nies li jgħixu fil-postijiet bil-kera. Fost ħafna affarijiet, il-Gabriel saqsejtu rigward għalfejn huwa l-ewwel nett involva ruħu fl-attiviżmu, x'taħseb il-union fuq is-suq tal-proprjetà f'Malta kif inhu bħalissa, ir-rilevanza ta' jum il-ħaddiem fil-kuntest tal-kampanja tagħhom u fl-aħħar mhux l-inqas ovvjament x'jaħsbu fuq kif marru s'issa bħala union u anke x'jixtiequ li jagħmlu fil-futur fil-qrib. Nfakkarkom li biex issegwu iktar minn dan il-proġett u anke x-xogħol tagħna bħala ġurnalisti, tistgħu segwuna fuq il-paġni fuq il-midja soċjali tagħna. Grazzi. Gabe, thank you for joining us for this interview. It's a pleasure to have you. So, I'll go over the basics for a bit and then I'll leave it up to you to introduce yourself to us. So, you're the first Secretary General of Solidarjetà, which is a new Maltese union that was set up in February of this year, right? And your campaigning so far has focused largely on tenants' rights within the Maltese context. So, first of all, just tell me a bit about yourself. Like, how did you get started in activism, for example?
So I started around 3 years ago in activism.
Okay.
I had just started university.
Okay.
And I saw kind of all the injustice that's in the world. It's not fair for people, sort of, you see that our current economic model doesn't work for everyone. And so I want to do my bit to try make our society more fair, more just.
Okay.
And so I started in activism with movement graffiti. And then from there I realized that a union would be the best organization for not only my skills but for what I'd like to achieve.
Okay.
And so I joined Solidarjetà.
Okay. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail later, but I'd like to kind of from the outset sort of clarify why you decided to focus so specifically on tenants' rights in Malta, because I feel, if I'm not mistaken, that's a unique approach.
Yes.
When it comes to unions in Malta. So what was the idea there?
Solidarjetà is a trade union,
Right.
but we are the first to have a tenant section.
Okay.
One of the reasons for this is that wage rises are great, and unions fight for those all the time. And we will also be fighting for wage rises. However, if rent prices keep on going up and up and up, and then they eat up what the union has won.
Right, of course.
It doesn't make sense.
So
in Malta,
even if a worker gets better income, if more of his income is eaten up by the rent, then you're in the same situation. I get it.
and this is an issue that we can see a lot of foreigners are facing, and a lot of young people are facing, not only with renting specifically, also with paying off their loan. We see that housing costs are really burdening young people and foreign people. And with the way that property prices and the rents in Malta have been skyrocketing almost, we thought that we had to fight in it, and they did not. Tenants particularly did not have a formal organization kind of fighting for their rights. And we thought it would be good if we could fill that space.
So you kind of try to formalize that network of tenants trying to support each other throughout.
There was tenant support. Movement Graffiti had already done some work in the past when the 2020 Private Residential Leases Act was being passed. And there were some other stakeholders as well. And we worked with them, basically, and a lot of them worked with us. And now we formalized this union.
Right, so that was kind of like a precursor to the union. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the central dynamic here, right? Because we're talking, after all, about power dynamic here. So we're talking about the dynamic between a landlord and a tenant. So obviously, the way the current situation is, the landlord has a much greater share of power over this dynamic, over this relationship, because ultimately they own the asset that is the subject of the contract. So there's an inherent inequality in that scenario. So I think for people it will be quite difficult to imagine how that gap can be bridged when structurally there is an inequality at the heart of it. So can you try and explain it in a more practical, sort of tangible way, sort of how that relationship can be equalized a bit better? Let's put it like that.
First of all, there's an inherent kind of power dynamic between a landlord and a tenant. Why? For a tenant, this property is their home.
Of course.
They live there, that is their primary residence most of the times. Whereas for a landlord, yes, it's their property. However, for them, it's an investment.
Of course.
And I'm sure for many that the income from a rental property might be important for how they live. For example, we've heard stories of a lot of landlords kind of supplementing their pensions with rental income.
Yeah.
However, there's still the power dynamic that the landlords have their home.
Yeah.
Tenants are living in the rental property and it is their home.
Yeah.
As a union, basically, we want to fight to make sure that the rental market is more stable. Right now, you see most contracts are of 1 year. When you look
Right.
abroad, you see contracts that are indefinite sometimes, or they're long-term contracts. This is not really the case in the Maltese rental market.
So you would say that mostly in the Maltese rental market, it's mostly for 1 year or so?
Well, the contracts renew.
Right.
However, yes, landlords prefer shorter term contracts. The market right now is more geared at shorter term contracts.
towards that,
Yes. And so we think that in order to have a more stable rental market, we need longer term contracts. We need prices that don't increase so much, as in wages are not increasing by the amount that property prices are increasing for sure. And so obviously it's unproportionate and is going to lead to workers struggling to be able to pay for their housing costs, whether that's a loan or whether it's rent.
When it comes to the way that you operate, right? So one of the things which I found was quite interesting about the way you describe yourselves and the way you've announced yourselves to the general public is that you focused a lot on two aspects which I think set you apart from other unions we've seen in Malta so far, which is you emphasize the idea that as much as possible not as much as possible, really, you are open to anyone from any country, from any denomination, from any, really, any background. So it's something you've emphasized a lot. It's a very internationalist tone, I would say, to your union. And you've also heavily emphasized the exclusion of partisan politics from the activities of your union. So I'd like you to explain a bit more why you put such an emphasis on this aspect and why you think it's important to operate in this manner.
Well, basically, as a union, we want to represent all workers' interests. And we don't think that nationality should come in between that.
Nice.
If you are a worker, you are a worker. And especially as you can see in Maltese society today, there are certain industries where there are more foreign workers in them, and unfortunately, they are often the most exploited.
Yeah. We've seen this with food delivery couriers, we've seen this with the catering industry in general. It's quite widespread. Construction as well.
We think it's important that these people aren't excluded. They are workers like us, and they should be represented. They should be able to have fair representation in the union in the same way. And yes, we are independent.
So when it comes to political affiliation,
Yes, exactly. We want to make sure that partisan connections don't hold us back. We are always going to fight kind of for workers' rights.
yeah. And you want to make it clear that
We want to make it clear that we are independent and that our campaigns are led only by our members.
okay. So I feel like the effort to distance yourselves from politics is also kind of perhaps related to ultimately your function as a union, right? So as in, if you are even perceived as being basically in bed with one political party or another, then that will obviously sway your ability to actively hold these political parties to account, because ultimately they will be the ones who are in government, and they will also be the ones taking the decisions which you need to take action about. So in fact, for example, I wanted to ask you about your first campaign so far. So I wanted to ask you about your campaign and the focus you've had so far on the Private Residential Leases Act specifically. So this has been quite a big battle for you. And I'll be asking you more specific questions about that later. So we'll be going into detail as to what the status of that act is at the moment and what you're hoping to achieve with your campaigning so far. But before going into that, I'd like to talk about the more practical things you've done as well. So for example, you've done inspections, for example, with tenants.
So essentially, we've had quite a few tenant members that come to us and tell us, we have this problem, we have that problem. To summarize basically the problems that we've had cases where tenants have won money at the dispute panel.
Okay.
And the landlord just refused to pay,
Right.
even after they won the case. And that's quite a simple legal procedure to get that money in the tenant's hands, where the court decided it was rightfully.
Yeah, so you already had the court's backing to be able to follow up on that.
Are there cases where a landlord refused to give the deposit back?
Okay.
And went with the tenant to their property, with the landlord present, and we say, listen, we think that the deposit should go back, and then the landlord can tell us, but there are these damages, some of them are wear and tear, and so the deposit should not be taken from them. Some, perhaps, they might have exaggerated the cost of the damages. So we are there to mediate as well as negotiate.
Kind of like a watchdog role as well, in a way, to kind of have an outside observer in the proceedings.
There were cases where, for example, there was mold in the property, and the tenant had asked the landlord to fix it, but the landlord didn't. So we're there kind of making sure, putting a bit of pressure on the landlord to fix the problems
to make sure it's actually dealt with.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Contracts that have clauses that, although are legal, can be registered with the housing authority, and we can check the contract and say, listen, this clause is illegal. For example, paying monthly for electricity.
Yes,
That's actually an
I've seen
illegal
your
clause.
post about this, for example, yeah.
However, unfortunately, it is included in many, many contracts.
Yeah. So it serves multiple purposes as well. So this kind of activity, besides this watchdog role that we're just discussing, you're also kind of educating the public as well when it comes to what their rights actually are, which I think is a very important part of your function. And quick side note, so far, what has the response been like to your union? So in terms of membership, in terms of, would you say it's been good so far? Would you say
It's been quite good, I think, for considering that we are only 2 months old.
Of course.
I think there was good support from tenants and tenants groups. I think kind of they've been waiting for someone to finally fight for them. Overall, the response has been good. I think it's needed. I think specifically for tenants, people have been waiting. Unfortunately, with certain landlords, perhaps they were not so fond of us, of course. However, we're ready to work with them to try make the rental market a better place and a fairer.
Because ultimately you're serving a role as a mediator, so it would benefit them as well to cooperate with you. Okay, so let's talk about the market at large for a second before going back to the Private Residential Leases Act. Because one of the things we've already spoken about, we've kind of touched upon it a bit, and I'd like to expand on it a bit further, is this idea that, it's backed by documentary evidence as well, that most of the property market in Malta is largely in the hands of Maltese people.
Yes.
Right? So most Maltese people, in fact, do own their own homes that they actually live in. Whereas it seems like from the statistical outline we have on this subject that most tenants, especially in the in the busier locations, like for example St. Paul's Bay, most of the tenants seem to be foreign nationals,
yes.
People who came to the country usually for work or for some other purpose of that kind. So the inherent inequality we were talking about there earlier in the first question we discussed today is also linked with nationality in this case, right? So there's a national element to it, right? Most homeowners are Maltese, and a significant chunk of tenants are in fact foreigners. So did this reality play a role, for example, in your decision to form a union which is internationalist in its mindset, which tries to welcome? So tell me a bit more about that process.
And I think that fact is also why tenants are often overlooked within the policy that's written. The fact is that in Malta, most landlords are Maltese. There's quite a large proportion of Maltese landlords that do not own hundreds and hundreds of properties. There are few that have maybe 5 or less, 3, 2.
Yeah.
And that has led to Maltese rental laws being quite far behind the rental laws of other countries, especially other European countries. And so yes, that has definitely played a role in why we decided.
In the thought process.
Exactly, why we decided that tenants would be the first group to focus on.
Okay, and of course this is also linked to an influx of foreign labor, right? So to the widespread practice in Malta of effectively, to some extent, in many cases, it has been proven that people were duped into accepting work placements in Malta, for example, which were promised to them in a certain way, which were promised to them in a sort of very attractive salary package, for example, but then it turned out not to be the case. So we also have this practice to blame for this boom in the property market, this increase in speculative buying as well, which is, as we said, the practice of essentially buying property as an investment, right? So you're buying it for the return on that investment rather than sort of for housing, right? For housing purposes. So what's your union's standpoint on that aspect of the market, right? Because these are the forces which are driving this inequality we're talking about. So what's the union's position on this situation, on this influx of foreign nationals, on these cheap contracts? What should be the approach? How do we fix or address this problem?
As I said, we wish to represent all workers, and all workers should be entitled to a workplace that respects their rights and treats them with dignity. And unfortunately, there's not oftentimes it could not be the case with these foreign workers. And it's also to do with the laws that govern visas, for example.
Yeah, of course.
That gives a lot of power to the employer.
Yeah.
So, for example, the fact that immigrant workers, third country national workers, if they are fired by their employer, they have only 10 days to find alternative employment. If not, their visa is rejected and they have to leave.
Yeah.
That gives quite a lot of power to the employer. And so, among other reasons, foreign nationals are treated very poorly. And unfortunately, this also extends to the rental market. For example, where we have seen, and the government is now tackling in these recent amendments, the issue of overcrowding,
Yes.
where
Yes.
um, sometimes they used to sleep on the floor. There was the famous case where they were sleeping in a stable.
Yeah, and I think that was an army, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
I think so.
There was also that SIEGA apartment with like 40 people
Yes,
cramped
exactly.
in a tiny space.
So, thankfully, the issue before these amendments is that overcrowding was not under the remit of the Housing Authority. However, with the amendments that will pass eventually, they will be, and the Housing Authority will be able to take action against overcrowding, where a lot of the times people were not living in places suitable for habitation.
Yeah.
They had one bathroom among quite a lot of people.
Yes.
Sometimes they had just mattresses on the floor. It's not right. So, yes.
Okay, and I'd like to sort of segue into another aspect of this, right, which is the lack of representation when it comes to foreign nationals. So, for example, from your end as a union, you're trying to address that balance. You're trying to sort of act as this watchdog, as this mediator for people who otherwise might not have the ability or maybe even the know-how to actually address a problematic landlord, for example. So an argument I've often heard when it comes to addressing this inherent lack of representation for the diverse communities of foreign nationals we have in the country is the idea that their status in society needs to be formalized more. So, for example, you mentioned working permits and residential arrangements, right? So, it's quite clear that the way the system works, a person's permission to stay in the country is very much dependent on their employer. However, what is the union's position when it comes to more to a wider sense of representation? So, for example, a topic which tends to have very divisive effect on the public's sentiment is the idea that foreign nationals who stay in Malta for a certain amount of time, after proving their good conduct and that they've paid their taxes and so on, they should even be entitled, for example, to voting rights or to participating in local council elections, for example, or even general elections. So what do you make of that argument? Do you feel like that lack of political representation in this case could be addressed in this manner?
I think that many of these foreign nationals, unfortunately, in the way they are being treated, they are being oftentimes othered by society at large. For example, the case of Kusi Dismark, where it was proven that he had contributed a lot to society. He not only paid taxes and national insurance,
Absolutely.
but he had a barber shop that was quite loved within the community, yet he was deported anyways. And I think, yes, you could be right that one of the reasons that a lot of migrants are treated this way is a lack of representation. And so I do think that people that have kind of shown to be contributing to our society should also take part in civil society and make sure that they're represented in whatever forms of local organizations or government.
I'd like to ask you a bit, this is sort of like a side branch kind of question, but it's very much related to what we're talking about. I feel like something which you will need to take into account, of course, is a potential for some measure of racist backlash at least, right? Because let's face it, the elephant in the room of this conversation is the fact that many foreign workers are considered in a very negative light simply because they are foreigners, simply because they are not from around here, right? So there's a very inherent sense of racism that we need to address here. Is your union worried about, for example, facing that kind of backlash, or have you even already maybe faced it in any instances where you were carrying out your day-to-day functions?
So far, thankfully, we have not
Okay.
faced any particular cases of racist backlash. what we'd like to emphasize as a union is that whether they're Maltese, whether they're from somewhere else, they are workers.
Do you think this man is your enemy? Huh? This is a worker. Any union keeps this man out ain't a union. It's a goddamn club.
And so they should have the rights that every other worker has, that every other tenant should have. So yes, I think that's the most important part, that we do not let nationality divide us. That what's most important is that these people have human rights and should be treated in the same way that everyone else, every Maltese person is treated in the workplace.
Okay. And should you, I know I'm going to be a bit difficult here, but should you be in a position where, let's say, a few months down the line, you've expanded your operations, you've perhaps recruited more members, and now you're growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and therefore there's a bigger segment of these communities which is being represented directly through your union, right? So of course, at that point in time, I imagine these people would be put forward and they would become, the front-facing aspect of this union. So have you tried to think perhaps of strategies of how to go about addressing the potential for this backlash, or what would be your argument? So for example, if I was someone who had to confront you directly and tell you, you're not a union that represents me because you're a union that has people who are coming to my country, and you might hear racist rhetoric in that context, in the context of that conversation. So besides this argument, besides the argument that, okay, we're all workers, it doesn't matter, how are we going to, both from your end as a union and on a national scale at large, right? How are we going to address this sentiment that props up anytime talks about integration, anytime that anyone talks about accepting the fact that we're now a multinational country? So what's the play there?
I think, unfortunately, oftentimes migrant workers are scapegoated as the problem. There are problems with the immigration and immigration policies. However, it is not the fault of the workers that come here to try make a better life for themselves, for their families. And I think a bit of empathy would make you realize that it is not their fault. So yes, I think there needs to be a bit more education and a bit more solidarity with these workers.
That's a good way of putting it, I mean.
Yes.
Very on brand.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, no, I like that answer. It's a good answer. Okay, so let's go back to the Private Residential Leases Act, right? So it's been, like we said, it's been a big bone of contention so far for you. So I'd like to give it the space it deserves, especially since it's an ongoing process at the moment as we speak. So let's start with trying to give like a very basic definition of what this law is, right? So if you have to explain it to someone who has no idea what you're talking about, basically, how would you describe it? So what is the Private Residential Leases Act?
So I think first I'll give a bit of history, kind of, with renting in Malta.
Sure.
So pre-1995, there were rental contracts where this rent would stay the same, essentially, for long periods of time. This rental contract would be inherited. And that led to landlords going to the European Court of Human Rights, where they won a case that said basically that landlords' rights were they weren't being treated fairly.
The right to enjoy property, if I remember correctly.
Yes, I think so, under Maltese law. So then, between 1995 and 2020, the Maltese rental market was mostly unregulated, where it was a bit of a jungle. Contracts were just person to person. They were not.
Nice. There was no formal system.
There was no formal system. And then in 2020, there was a step in the right direction, where there were certain laws that landlords had to follow. For example, the minimum contract length had to be 1 year. How a contract had to be set out, when a landlord could tell you that you had to leave the property,
Right.
when a tenant could say that they are leaving the property.
So it was
It's
the first
formalized.
attempt at regulating it.
Exactly. And it was a good first step.
Okay.
However, it was only a small step, and Maltese rental laws were still behind.
Okay.
But that's where we are with the current Private Residential Leases Act. However, I think in January or December, the ministry announced that they were making amendments
Right.
to the Private Residential Leases Act. Firstly, they tackled overcrowding, which, as I discussed previously, was very important and very much needed. However, there were some clauses that we took issue with, four main clauses. The first one was that they were going to make the deferment period the entire length of the contract.
So what is a
So,
deferment
yes,
period?
of course. A deferment period basically is a period where you are liable for the rent. So kind of you're telling, when you enter a contract of 1 year, you have a deferment period of 6 months.
Right.
Where basically you are telling the landlord, as a tenant, I will be paying for those 6 months for sure.
Yeah, okay, it's like a guarantee.
Yes. As long as there aren't serious breaches of
Of course.
rights.
Okay.
After that, a tenant can give a landlord 1 month's notice, and they can leave the property without losing their deposit and without being held liable for the rest of the contract.
Okay.
Now, what was being proposed is that the deferment period becomes the entire length of the contract, even when
Right.
it is renewed. So, in that case, a tenant would only be able to leave penalty-free at the end of their contract, whether that's the first contract or the renewed contract. And we took issue with that because the main reason that tenants leave the property are not for trivial matters.
Of course.
A lot of the times it is because they have issues with the property, such as broken appliances or mold. And
Yeah, of course.
yes, that a tenant could go to the dispute panel. However, when you are a foreigner in a country, when you might be your first 6 months in a country,
Yeah.
you cannot expect someone to go through Maltese law and know all of their rights
course,
and
it's
know
not
how
familiar
to
to
build a legal case to take the landlord to court.
Yeah.
Plus, with a lot of these third country nationals being in the precarious position that they are in, oftentimes they are scared to be seen as
course.
troublemakers.
Of course.
And so the deferment period gave tenants some security that after 6 months, if the problems were too bad,
You can leave.
they could leave, give 1 month's notice, and leave the property. So that was the first issue
You had with
Yeah,
this
yes.
amendment, yeah.
Another issue that we had with one of the clauses was that a contract right now, the way it is if you have a contract of however long, if at the end of the contract neither party decides to terminate, the contract is automatically renewed.
Okay.
So that means the terms of the contract remain the same, and you continue living for another contract period. So if it was 2 years, you live for another 2 years. If it was 1 year, you live for another 1 year. And this can keep on going. What this clause was trying to introduce was that landlords, after once the contract was going to be renewed, could still increase the rent by 5%. And not only that, that the rent could be increased by 5%, compounding from when it was last increased.
Right, so
let's
year
say-
on year.
Correct. So let's say you've been in a property
Right.
and the contract has renewed 2 times.
Okay.
So now you're entering your 3rd year.
Okay.
A landlord could increase the rent by 5% compounded for 3 years, which all of a sudden is not fair.
That's a huge gap. And just to clarify, this is not pegged to any actual improvements to the household, for example, right?
No, it is not. However, to be clear, it is pegged to the property price index.
Okay.
So
okay.
the maximum is 5%, or however much the property. So the property price index or 5%, whichever is the least.
Okay. Okay.
So
there's some cap to it.
Yes. However, the property price index has been increasing by more than 5% per year since 2020 at least.
Okay.
So it has essentially been 5%.
I see.
Okay.
And
yes.
what is so these are amendments which were going to be originally introduced, right? So since you've started your lobbying, and of course I imagine other organizations might have participated in this as well, what has changed? So has the government's proposed amendment changed so far?
So far,
What's the point of the process now?
We know of only one clause that has changed, and that is the thermal clause that was going to make the thermal
so the
period
6-month period being
correct,
extended to
the
rest of
entire contract. That has been changed. However, much more than that, we do not know. We had attended the first, so once the amendments were proposed, there was first the first parliamentary session, where basically all the MPs read the bill. Second parliamentary reading, where they discuss it, and then there was the committee stage. We spoke at the last committee stage, and so did some other tenants, and so did the MDA and the Landlord Association, and we gave our opinions on the amendments. Right now, we are still in the committee stage, and most likely, before this interview comes out, it could be that the committee stage has happened, and we'll know what version, essentially, of the amendments will be heading to Parliament for final approval.
Okay, and what was this public consultation process like for you? As in, obviously, I think this was pretty much the first instance in which you were engaging in such direct lobbying about a specific piece of legislation. So, how would you describe that consultation process? Do you feel like you were genuinely consulted to begin with?
Yes. I mean, the ministry, whenever we wanted to speak to them, they let us speak to them. We were invited on a few occasions to speak to them, and we did make our opinion heard with them. We also spoke with the opposition and told them, because of course the committee has 3 people from the opposition and 3 MPs from the current government. And we discussed with both, essentially, making our opinions heard and why we think these clauses should be changed. And yes, I think we managed to show the tenants' perspective on why these clauses should not be the way they were originally planned to be. And so now we will see what happens to these amendments.
The outcome will be.
However, I think it's already quite a good step that the deferment period has changed.
Okay, so you feel like in terms of consultation it was a good start?
Yes.
Okay, and what are you hoping to achieve? So, as you said, this interview is currently being filmed before the outcome of this process will be concluded. But what are you hoping that will come out of this? So, what's the ideal version of this amendment that you would like to see?
Well, essentially, the ideal version would be that overcrowding is tackled. But however, since there's been this agreement between the stakeholders in the market on the other clauses, they stay as they are. This overcrowding amendments, they get passed, and we discuss more at length between the stakeholders to try get a more stable market and get
Okay.
other amendments to fix this.
Right, so you think it's obviously your campaign is going to extend just beyond this one
course.
amendment, and you're hoping that the government will be more open to more suggestions down the line
Yes.
in relation to any further amendments. One other thing I would like to talk about is, again, related also as well to when we are planning on publishing this interview. So this interview is going to be published just a day before International Workers' Day, which is a very important date in the calendar, in particular of the current government as well, since it is, after all, the Labour Party. It is a government that owes its roots to the very same principles. It is a party that owns, whose principles are very much rooted in the same principles which you are pushing forward through your activism in this union. So a big part of the problems we've discussed today are all very much linked to the Labour government's neoliberal approach to the property market. It is very much a continuation of previous trends we've also seen in past administrations. When it comes to the property market, it's always been very much this unregulated system, which, as we said, I mean, we started this regulation process 4 years ago, right? So it's a very new aspect of this. So I'd like to get your sense of perspective on this government's policies, right, which we're saying that are very much a continuation of the previous policies that were in place, but it is also quite clear that there has been an escalation, right? So the prices of property have increased very heavily over the last decade. The problems related to exploitation that we've discussed have also increased over the last decade. So what is your union's position when it comes to this government's approach to the property market in general, right? So beyond this amendment, when it comes to these policies in general, what's your take on that?
So, on this issue, obviously, property prices have been constantly increasing. Why is that? Because, as we discussed previously, there has been a lot of speculative investment in property. On properties that should be primarily people's personal homes. We think it's great, kind of, that the so many Maltese people own their homes, and throughout this time, the government has given quite a few benefits to Maltese citizens to help them purchase their homes. However, this widespread development is not only bad, unfortunately, for Malta's environment, but it's also bad for the market as a whole, for everyone.
And the people who ultimately depend on that market.
For example, personally, as a young Maltese person, it's difficult for me looking at kind of the Maltese property market, seeing
Of course.
when will I be able to leave my parents' house, kind of. It's difficult and perhaps that's not being made clear yet because perhaps youth are not very active in politics for one reason or another. And so something has to be done for these prices to stop going up and up and up. And while the schemes that the government has put in place are highly beneficial to Maltese people, it unfortunately excludes foreign nationals. So clearly these solutions are not the be-all end-all. And there needs to be regulations in place to stop property prices from increasing so much and stop rent from increasing so much, and make sure that the market is more stable and more secure for everyone.
And in fact, I mean, we are talking about what you are already doing, right? So at the moment you are already, in fact, very much engaged with this process of public consultation, and you're trying to engage in this process of essentially negotiating with the government, with the legislators in Parliament as well, to ensure that you are taking a very direct and proactive approach in tackling these issues. However, if and when, for example, you happen to be faced with a scenario where you're trying all the typical routes So you're trying to go through the legislative process, through the parliamentary process, all the normal avenues that are available to you as a union. However, if the negotiating approach fails, if the diplomatic approach fails, so if you try to get your points across in this manner and you feel like you're not being listened to, how will you approach that situation? What ideas would you consider using to get the government to meet you at the negotiating table if they don't want to? How would you go about it?
So, of course, for both the trade union side and also our tenant section, we strive that our campaigns are led by our members, that we constantly have a back and forth between our members and us and make sure that what we're doing, how we're doing it, the actions we take are all kind of discussed with our members and that they agree with what we're doing. Because ultimately we are fighting on their behalf for them. So if the negotiating doesn't work and the members think that we need to take more drastic action, so that could be protests, that could be strikes, it could be other forms of actions. If that is what our members want, we will do what our members say, of course. We will consult with our legal team and make sure that everything that's being proposed will keep them safe legally.
Of course.
Make sure that, for example, if they are going on strike, that the union is recognized by the employer so that the employer cannot fire them for going on strike.
Yeah.
So yes.
No, of course, you'd make sure that all your legal bases are covered, but at the end of the day...
We will inform our members, and from there they can decide what action makes the most sense for them.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. All right, so this is more or less the last theme I'd like to touch up on, which is, as we've said, your union is very young. It's only 2 months old, maybe 3 months old by the time we publish, I think. But
Almost 2 months old.
exactly. So it's a bit early to tell what such actions would look like, for example, but this was more just to get an idea. But what is your plan? So as in, when it comes to what you're hoping to achieve, let's say within the first 12 months of being operational as a union, what would you think is your ideal target to aim for at the moment?
So we want to make sure one of our targets is that tenants are not only represented, but also well educated.
Nice.
That tenants know of their rights,
Okay.
not only once their rights have been broken, because they've signed a contract with the legal clauses, but that they are made aware of their rights before they sign any form of contract.
Right. Okay, I understand. Yeah.
And that if there are exploitative practices going on, that we help our tenants fight, as we've done already, and either get the money that's owed to them, or that they are living in suitable homes and that the landlords are not taking advantage of tenants. So we'd like to expand our tenant section and build not only a sort of a union can be sometimes kind of abstract, kind of alien, that you go to your union and then you come back with the reply. We want our union to be more community-led.
Okay, I understand.
So that our members are part of a community, kind of.
Yeah.
So I think that would also be important that we grow that community aspect, that our members truly feel like they are connected to the other members, and that they know that the union is theirs.
Yeah.
The union is run by our members, and the members kind of are the decision makers in the union. They are the ones that will guide us on what policies we take, what actions we take. So that's an important also role, that we are kind of empowering this union spirit within not only our members, but hopefully also society at large.
Okay.
Other than that, we'll also be focusing on the trade side, we have a few campaigns that we are working on the trade side as well.
Okay.
So yes, we'll also be expanding that trade side, making sure that we are representing not only tenants, of course, our workers,
Of course.
but making sure that we're not only representing them at their homes and their rental properties, but also on the workplace.
Okay, that's great. I wish you the best of luck for this process. So, just to kind of wrap it up, I always tend to like to ask whether my guest has any particular message they would like to forward to the audience, whether there's anything that you would like to say to any aspiring members, perhaps, who might be weighing out the possibility of joining your union, sort of. What's the core message that you'd like to get across to them today?
I think it's that to not be apathetic.
Nice.
That sometimes workers, students, tenants end up in a situation where they know that they're not being treated fairly,
Yeah.
but they just stick to it because they're kind of like, that's what it is, eh?
Perhaps
I'm
feeling
in an unfair.
powerless
They're
to tackle
powerless.
it.
But perhaps as an individual you may be powerless. But even then you are not as an individual. But
Yeah,
especially
I understand.
together in a community where you are being given the support that you need, given the resources that you need, you can definitely fight for not only changes in your life,
Yeah.
but also in the lives of everyone in Malta. So what I would say is do not be apathetic, and make sure to fight for your rights. Make sure that just because you are a worker, just because you don't think you have the power to change things, it's not true. You do.
That's great. Where can we find you? So if someone wants to join your union, what would they need to do? Just give us a quick...
So we're Solidarjetà on Facebook and Instagram, and we post there quite often. We also have our website, solidarjetà.org, where we have our tenant rights section, where you can understand basically the current law in a more simple English. You don't have to go through all the legal
Legalese.
speak. Exactly. And we'll also be any campaigns that we're working on will also be posted there. And that's where you can become a member.
Okay.
We have our form where you can speak, where you can sign up, and where you can access the kind of member-only services that we have, such as like contract checking, contract negotiating. And if anyone has a problem, basically message us on those platforms. We have our WhatsApp as well on our social medias and our website. And you can send us an email at union@solidarjetà.org.
Perfect. Those were all the questions I had from my end, Gabe. Thank you for being on our show today.